So today we are talking about haunted Edinburgh.
So the South Bridge vaults. The bridge, for its time, was an engineering masterpiece. It was 1,000 feet long,
Wow.
and it was built as a viaduct-style bridge with
Okay.
19 viaduct arches.
hmm
And once the bridge was built, those who had financial clout suggested, well, okay, now that we've connected these two parts of the city and we have this bridge, why don't we form I guess you'd call it a shopping community. Let's get
Yeah,
Edinburgh's
like a
first
park. Yeah.
shopping area
Mhm.
together. And so they started constructing these buildings in that Cowgate area,
Right.
building up along both sides of the bridge. And what it did was it covered over these arches.
Yeah,
Um,
which is quite common actually in the UK. Like if you're familiar, there's a lot of those viaduct bridges, and they built businesses right into the niches that were once those arches. And if anybody watches Coronation Street, even on Coronation Street, some of the bistros and the mechanics garage and all of that are built into these viaduct niches, right? They make a perfect spot to put a business now, and a lot of storage units and things too that went into those. So yeah.
yeah, yeah. So these businesses, kind of took over the archways,
hmm
incorporated them into their building structures, and as you say, they were um, turned into like storage areas
Yeah.
for these businesses, workshops,
hmm
and out of the 19 arches in this bridge, 18 of them were incorporated, and there's only one today that still exists out in the open.
Oh wow.
And and I've actually got a photo of it here that I pulled off of Google Maps Street View,
Okay.
and I don't know how well this is going to show up, but
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
but you
Okay.
can
Oh yeah,
see,
yeah. Okay, yeah. You can
yeah, you
see
can
how
see that
it's
this is
mhm,
the last
the
single
last
arch, and
remaining
you can
arch
see how the buildings on both sides have
kind of
just
taken
taken
over.
over all the other
Yeah.
arches.
Cool.
And
So yeah, they built into and on the fronts of the old bridge.
yeah, and so once it was all incorporated and covered over, they did construction inside, um, building passageways, turning the arches into vault rooms, as I say, to
Right.
create their workshops, and the bridge was not waterproofed at all.
Oh
So
wow.
every time it rained,
It just
water
makes
would seep into these
yeah.
vaults and flood everything out and just damage and destroy everything these businesses were
Wow.
using the vaults for. And so eventually they were abandoned because of this. And in the early 1800s, with the Industrial Revolution coming in, um, that Cowgate Southbridge area unfortunately turned into the slums of Edinburgh.
Right.
And the the conditions got really bad, and these homeless people moved into the vault areas because they
Mhm.
had nowhere else to go.
Right.
And not only not only the homeless, but it also created a situation with, let's call the less desirable individuals.
Right. And I got to interject just because you might say
Yeah,
it, but Burke and Hare were highly associated with this area. This is where they came and took some of their victims that they then murdered and sold off to the medical school, right?
that's
So
correct.
one of
That's
my favorite
correct.
one of my favorite gruesome stories of Edinburgh.
Yeah,
Burke and
yeah,
Hare. But they were very well known for frequenting this area for victims.
yep. They were the body snatchers. But the conditions inside the vaults, just because of the construction, the way they had been turned out, in the warmer months, the vaults were just stifling. They were humid.
Right.
In the colder weather, they were absolutely freezing and damp. And it just created this horrible situation for these unfortunate people that were forced to move in there.
Right, to live in those
And
conditions.
a lot of that has created the paranormal aspect that is now within these vaults. And there's also a story that in 1824 there was a fire that went through the Cowgate area and Southbridge. And the story goes that people had fled down into the vaults to escape the fire. And with the ventilation, the smoke from the fire filled down into the vaults, and a lot of these people suffocated because the smoke was coming in instead of being ventilated out. The roofs of the vaults, of course, being rounded, much like an old 18th century brick oven would have been, created the same effect as a cooking oven, and a lot of the people, it's said, were just roasted alive.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's that area alone too. I've read a great deal about it, and I know when we were planning our tour, that was one of the areas that we were going to visit for sure, was that section, just because it's just got such a creepy old aspect. And it, that sort of area kind of juxtapositions Whitechapel in London, in terms of the conditions and the people, and just, the lack of humanity, not by the people there, but just of the general populace that didn't live in the area, not caring about those people that were in that area. But certainly one of the really interesting spots in Edinburgh. And I'm sure, it's like us, right? When you live in a location, you've heard about it so many times, and you've probably been there if you have any interest in it. And people are like, oh yeah, that's not that interesting to us anymore. But, for those of us who haven't been and haven't been able to see it, these are the kinds of things that, we of course are interested in. I want to also mention another location that, while it's not a viaduct and it's not a bridge, it's Mary King's Close. And Mary King's Close is a place that we were going to go and visit. And it goes back to about 400 years ago, where it was a street. And I think the staircase in Mary King's Close is one of the most famous staircases ever photographed in the city of Edinburgh. It's, if you look it up, it's got, there's always a picture of laundry hanging between the buildings, but it's this narrow little, sort of street that goes up with a set of stairs. And if people aren't aware, Edinburgh is very hilly. It's actually built on an old volcanic crater. And so it's, it's a little bit like San Francisco or some other locations where there's a lot of up and down in Edinburgh. So you're upstairs and very steep roads. And if you're walking there, you're really getting a workout in Edinburgh, because it's, there's kind of an upper and a lower, and the city just moves up. And of course, my great going back at least 10 times now, grandmother, who was Mary Queen of Scots, Holyrood Palace, the castle sits up on top of the abutment there and looks out over the city. So it has really spectacular views, and we'll get to the castle because it's got its own haunted stories. But Mary King's Close is really cool because it was this area about 400 years ago, and it would have been a busy little area in Old Town. And of course, at that time, you would be able to look up at the sky and, see the sky and these buildings and very narrow streets. But it's interesting today because today it's actually underground. So it's named after apparently a prominent businesswoman whose name was Mary King. in the 1630s. So we're going back to essentially the Renaissance period still here. And so we have this area which is now underground and has a lot of, urban legends around it. Again, supernatural things. And these supernatural sightings have been going on since that time period. So in 1645, the plague rolled through. We can relate to that. But, again, we can and we cannot, because what we have today is certainly not what the bubonic plague was in 1645. And while, people are suffering now, I think that back then, just with the lack of any kind of real medical knowledge, must have been terrifying to have something like that happening. But victims were actually quarantined and left to just die in the streets, and then they were covered up. And so this area was one of those sections that they supposedly put these victims, and then they just buried it. And it was reopened again to the public in the 2000s. I think it was early 2000s, 2003, 2004. And it's become a really popular location now, and there's tours through there all the time. So depending exactly what the history, what really happened there, just the fact that they ended up burying this location interests me.
Is that right? What they call the underground city?
Yeah, I believe that that's part of the underground. It's these warren of small, narrow streets that, ended up being buried. And and so now it's open again to the public. But it's just got such a strange history to it, just that little area alone. And you can only imagine that if they really did bury plague victims in there, and I'm not really sure how true that is, because if it was closed down for all that time, and then they didn't reopen it until the 2000s, there would still be evidence of bodies there. And I couldn't find anything